This week, free speech under fire. The freedom without which we have no other freedom is at risk more than at any other time in recent history, according to a UK expert. The shocking result in the Ben Roberts-Smith defamation case. McGowan Gone. Victoria Police's massive PR fail. And the attack on the nuclear family, as big government wants to have more control over your kids than you do. G'day and welcome to The Other Side Australia on ADH TV for the weekend starting Friday the 2nd of June. This is episode 208. I'm Damian Coory and this is the show that brings you a detailed wrap of the top stories of the past week in politics and culture from Australia and around the world to get you into the weekend across all the things that matter. And we declare our bias right up front. We support classical liberal values, that free people operating in a free society and a free marketplace makes everything better for everyone, while big government trying to make everything better for everyone just makes everything worse. It's not a view that's popular in Australia anymore, but it used to be until the old media journalists stopped caring about it. We're here to help rebalance that, so are all of the team at ADH TV, Alan Jones, Mark Stein, Alexandra Marshall, Fred Paul, Lyle Shelton, Dave Pello, Daisy Cousins, Professor David Flint, Nick Cater and you, without whose support in promoting our platform and our shows to your friends, both online and offline, we wouldn't be able to continue doing what we're doing. It has been a massive news week, so let's get into it. After 5 years and 100 court sitting days, the verdict in the biggest defamation case in Australian history was delivered on Thursday, and it was a shocking result for the former SAS soldier who brought the case against Nine Entertainment, the owners of the Sydney Morning Herald and Melbourne Age newspapers. The judge in the civil defamation trial found that Victoria Cross recipient Ben Roberts-Smith committed serious war crimes, including the murder of 2 civilians, a one-legged man dragged from a tunnel at a compound and a farmer kicked off a cliff in the village of Darwan while Roberts-Smith was serving with the SAS in Afghanistan. The judge found Roberts-Smith broke the moral and legal rules of military engagement and is therefore a criminal. Further, that he disgraced his country and the Australian Army. Now look, we need to give a lot of leeway to the men and women who put their lives on the line for our defence. We cannot apply the rules of civilian life in Australia to a war zone in Afghanistan. Otherwise, nobody will be willing to serve and defend us. But there are rules of engagement in war. And in this case, there was graphic, detailed evidence from other SAS soldiers against Roberts-Smith. Here's how Channel 9 reported the news of the verdict Thursday afternoon.
There were mountains of evidence. There were dozens of witnesses. It was just such a huge case. It was by proxy a war crimes trial, not just what Ben Roberts-Smith was arguing. And it also went to the heart of press freedom. That's why James Chessel there was so emotional, I guess, that this case has got up, that he's agreed that the newspaper stories were true. So that's a huge issue. But also what is so important to come out of this is what happens now to the SAS. Not too many people are talking about that, but that's a huge issue because what this case did, it did shine a spotlight into the actions of what is a covert, very secretive operation. What happens into the future of the SAS? How accountable will they have to be for all their actions?
That's Channel 9's senior reporter, Mark Burrows. After the verdict was handed down, the managing director of publishing for Nine newspapers, James Chessel, had this to say.
The judgment is a vindication for journalists Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters, who began reporting this difficult and complicated story more than 7 years ago. It is a vindication for the many people in our newsrooms and our organisation who supported this really important public interest journalism. And most importantly, it is a vindication for the brave soldiers of the SAS who served their country with distinction and then had the courage to speak the truth about what happened in Afghanistan.
Journalist Nick McKenzie also spoke after the verdict. He called Roberts-Smith a war criminal, a bully and a liar, and said it was a day of justice for the brave men of the SAS who stood up and told the truth about who Ben Roberts-Smith really is. The journalist recounted the story of Ali Jan, a man who was kicked down a cliff by Ben Roberts-Smith, who then ordered another soldier to shoot him.
Ali Jan was a father. Ali Jan was a husband. He has children who no longer have a father. He has a wife who no longer has a husband. He was kicked off a cliff by Ben Roberts-Smith and he was murdered with Ben Roberts-Smith's participation.
That's journalist Nick McKenzie speaking outside the court, as reported by 9 News on Thursday. Now, Ben Roberts-Smith is going to appeal this ruling, so we need to at least make that clear. A lot of people are saying this is a bad day for the SAS. I actually think it's a good day for the SAS because it demonstrates the brave men who were willing to break that very powerful code that they have within the SAS and step up and be counted and tell their story and tell the story as they saw it and what they saw and that they believed was morally and ethically wrong and breached the rules of engagement. So I think this is a positive long term for the SAS, a positive for the Australian military and our armed forces, and I think it sends a pretty powerful message to Australia and to the world that we have a very strong and professional force and a strong and professional SAS. An estimated $25 million in legal costs may now need to be paid, probably by Ben Roberts-Smith's side. His case was financially backed by Kerry Stokes, who was the head of the 7 network. A friend of mine likes to keep reminding everyone that Australia has a green government. Well, one green government in its smallest territory, and they're the junior party in a coalition with the Labor Party. But we tend to forget that the Australian Capital Territory government is a Labor-Green coalition. And since the Greens are not an environmental party, but a party whose policies reflect very far-left socialist ideas more generally, it's pretty scary stuff for people like us who believe in liberalism. And we got a taste of just how big the government's powers under a Labor-Green coalition government can get this week when the fundamental golden rule of liberal democracy, the right to own property and have those rights securely protected under the law, was, well, just kind of run roughshod over. The ACT government is doing a forced takeover of the Calvary Public Hospital, which is run by the Catholic Church. The church has run the hospital for 44 years, and the lease was for 120 years. But the ACT Minister for Health, Rachel Stephen-Smith, wants to consolidate public hospitals to create a single network, which she says, quote, will allow us to better coordinate our health services, distribute resources more effectively, strengthen the capacity of our workforce, plan infrastructure on a territory-wide basis, and improve health outcomes. She wants to take it over, knock it down, and build a bigger public hospital on the Calvary site. The problem with governments doing stuff like this is that it sends a very bad message to anyone else who has a lease to run something. And this is something left-wing and socialist governments all around the world don't understand when they take stuff over and try to run it themselves. When you do that, nobody else trusts you ever again to keep your word. And trust is core to how our free market economy works. And property rights are core to how liberal democracies survive. You might remember that we had a segment on the show a couple of weeks back looking at how historians believe that a major reason that some of history's greatest empires collapsed was a lack of faith in property rights. That's all it took. If people don't know what belongs to them and can have confidence that if they invest their money and their brains and their blood, sweat and tears into that for a few years, that it's still going to be theirs later on when it all pays off. If they can't have that confidence, they'll stop bothering. And this is why this is so bad. There wasn't much consultation. There wasn't any reason given by the Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory. It was just a case of, sorry, we'll be taking that and running it better. Thank you. It's quite troubling stuff, and the federal government does need to step in and put the ACT government, which, let's face it, is little more than a city council, back in its place. Opposition leader Peter Dutton says that as a federal territory, the Commonwealth does have the power to step in and override. Anthony Fisher, who's the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, has also called on Albo to step in to protect religious freedom and reassure all religious organisations that have contracts for aged care and health services that those contracts won't just be ripped up on a whim. And the chair of the Calvary Hospital Task Force, Father Tony Percy, wrote that, quote, "No Australian likes to be dispossessed of their land and property. No Australian likes their contract ripped up unilaterally. One of the most significant reasons why Australia is a free and fair nation is because of our property rights, which ensure stability." Bingo. What's even more laughable is that the government has enough trouble running the Canberra Public Hospital very well, let alone taking over a second one. The ACT government is tiny, but it sure has controversies at the moment. There have been more revelations in the final week of that the public part of the inquiry into the handling of the Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lehrmann rape case. By the way, two things not to miss that we don't have time in this week's show to bring you. One is Alan Jones' interview with Peter Dutton this week. It was a great discussion. Make sure you check that out. It's in Alan's Tuesday night show, which you can grab on demand. And the other one was one of the finest pieces of newspaper writing that I've seen in ages. It was Janet Albrechtson's column in The Australian, posted Wednesday morning, entitled "The Indigenous Voice to Parliament, How the Voice of Reason Has Been Lost to Emotional Abuse." I really wish we had time to bring you more detail on that, but we don't, unfortunately, in this week's episode. But do go and check it out for yourself. It is superb stuff. Anyway, back to the inquiry. Remember how when Brittany Higgins appeared at court, she was often flanked by two women? Most people assumed that they were her legal team, but they weren't. One of them was a director from the Labor-leaning Sydney Government Relations PR firm, Hawker Britton. She said she was one of Brittany's friends and was helping support her with the media stuff. The other one was Victims of Crime Commissioner for the Australian Capital Territory, Heidi Yates. She acted as an intermediary between police and Brittany Higgins during the whole investigation. And that's part of the role that she has in supporting alleged victims of crime. But there were concerns that because she was often by Higgins' side during the trial, that this may have had a negative effect on the perception of Bruce Lehrmann's presumption of innocence. Anyway, Heidi Yates was in the witness box at the inquiry this week, and a few things were revealed. Firstly, that Yates knew about Higgins' sexual assault allegation a month before she went public, that she accompanied her to meetings with Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison, there's nothing wrong with that, and this is the slightly unusual bit, that before she met Higgins, she was told by an unnamed man who was a presenter at an event that he was working with a young woman who was about to make a sexual assault disclosure which would likely attract national media attention. He then told Heidi Yates that he was gathering messages of support for the woman and asked her if she'd provide one. Yates told the inquiry that she provided an email of just general support. A part of what the inquiry is considering is whether Yates acted in accordance with her relevant statutory framework, the rules that govern her position as the Victims of Crime Commissioner in the support that she gave to Brittany Higgins. Yates was asked about her decision to be so visible at court, walking beside Brittany Higgins past the gathered media every day, and whether this may have affected Bruce Lehrmann's presumption of innocence perceptions. She defended her actions by saying that she'd discussed it with the ACT Director of Public Prosecutions, Shane Drumgold, and that he had raised no concerns and nor had the Defence Counsel. Then she was asked about her decision to stand next to Higgins during the speech that Higgins gave outside the court in October, less than an hour after the trial was aborted. She said at that time she was making arrangements to return Ms Higgins to her accommodation. That was what was on her mind. She wasn't focused on what Higgins may or may not say in her announcement. She said the Victims of Crime Commissioner's clients make their own decisions about what they want to do, but she conceded that if she had reflected on it, she might not have decided to stand next to her so visibly. She also said that her role requires her to, quote, start from a position of belief of a complainant, and that in practice it'd be impossible to run a victim support service in any other way. And that is it for the public hearings. They've been adjourned now, so what is next? Well, the inquiry chairman, Walter Sofronoff KC, will now get a final written submissions from each party. Then he'll consider all that evidence. He might reopen hearings next week if he decides that some of those written statements need to be further examined. And the final report will all be handed down on July 31. Well, a really has been a big news week. Australia now has one less leader that has very little respect for freedom. WA Premier Mark McGowan pulling up stumps. The official reason, because he's tired. West Australians love this guy, don't get me wrong. He had a 91% popularity rating at one stage, which was an all-time record for Australian pollsters, the highest of anyone ever. And of course, at the last WA election, the people rewarded his unbelievably strict school principal approach to COVID with a resounding victory that almost wiped the poor new woke Liberal Party off the map in the West. The Liberal Party ended up with just 2 seats in the 59-seat WA Parliament. Unbelievable.
Today I'm announcing that I'll be stepping down as Premier and as member for Rockingham.
He's wrapping up an almost 30-year career in politics and more than 11 years as head of the Labor Party.
We have the strongest economy in Australia and one of the strongest in the world. We turned our finances around, returning the budget to surplus and with debt being repaid. We regained the AAA credit rating. We have the best funded healthcare, police and education services in Australia.
While many praised McGowan's achievements this week, National Party Senator Matt Canavan told Sky News First Edition program that he missed a lot of opportunities, that is McGowan missed a lot of opportunities, to lock in big investments and projects for Western Australia and the rest of the country.
When you look back over the last 6 years in Western Australia, there hasn't been a significant amount of inbound investment to large capital projects, which is the lifeblood of that state. Admittedly, COVID did have an impact on projects like Browse when gas prices fell quickly, but we've had very high commodity prices now for a year or two since COVID, and we haven't just been able to land a major iron ore project, a major expansion of gas production in Western Australia. And I think partly that's at least due to the fact that Mark McGowan struggled to rein in some of the Green activists with his own government. He would talk a big game on Canberra, but has certainly rolled over in the past year. To the newly elected Albanese government, hasn't taken up the gas industry's fight as they fight an ongoing war with the government here. So there's a lot of missed opportunities for Western Australia in the last few years, and as we see iron ore prices fall now, gas prices come down to more moderate levels, we may look back on this period as a missed opportunity not to lock in some of those large capital investments.
That's Senator Matt Canavan. ADH TV's Fred Paul had his own personal issues with Mark McGowan's COVID overreach and border closure policies.
I visited several times during that period to spend time with my dying mum. Sadly, thanks to McGowan's heavy-handed state border controls, I wasn't allowed to make it back for her dying days or her funeral in September 2021. But 2 teams of AFL players and their extensive entourages were permitted to enter Western Australia at that time for the far more important purpose of playing an AFL Grand Final.
It's infuriating. Let's not be too quick to forget the horrors of COVID overreach. I've often said the problem with COVID overreach is that it affected people unevenly. Some people suffered greatly due to bad luck, many others benefited. And in a democracy, unfortunately, it doesn't matter how much pain you inflict on the few or how unjustifiable and immoral that may be, so long as the majority is comfortable, you're going to stay in power. And the manipulation of people through fear for political gain, by overstating the COVID threat to justify lockdowns and mandates that went well beyond anything we should ever permit in a liberal democracy at any time, unfortunately works. It will get you re-elected, but that doesn't make it moral or right. Let's go back to November 2021, when Queensland and WA were considering finally opening their borders and stopping the nonsense just before Christmas. And remember, we now know, as they all knew then, that there was never any evidence to show that the vaccine stopped transmission of the virus, and there was plenty of emerging evidence about the horrible effects that internal Australian border closures were having on business, families, and people's mental and physical health. Here's Channel 9 reporter Damian Ryan back in November 2021.
All I want for Christmas is to go to Queensland. And if a border opening is on your wish list this year, it just might come early, as the Sunshine State surges towards 80% double vaxxed.
We're on target to reach it by the 17th of December, but as I just said, we're now almost like a week earlier.
In WA, a cautious Premier continues to play Grinch. 90% vaccination rate will be the key to opening in late January or February.
The adventurous and unsafe approach was New South Wales, and what you saw there was hundreds and hundreds of people lose their lives.
But not because they honoured our federation and allowed Australians to move freely inside their own country. New South Wales, like the rest of Australia, had among the lowest COVID death rates in the world. No, premiers like McGowan abused our fears and manipulated us for their own political gain. They saw opportunity and they seized it, and it worked. McGowan may be popular with the majority who fall for his parochial WA messages and criticism of the eastern states. But the ethical minority of West Australians who aren't so childish and easily manipulated won't ever forget what he did. And they joined those of us in Queensland and Victoria who wait eagerly for the other two members of the anti-freedom threesome to follow in his footsteps and fade into oblivion. It's a shame, really. We'll miss great PR stunts like this one.
Sultry. It is sultry. Oh. There's no doubt about that.
Do you think so?
Oh yeah. Look at him. Look at you. Like you're having a date with him.
Across the table.
I quite fancy him actually.
Candle lit.
You do actually, don't you? You've got a thing for McGowan.
I've got a thing for McGowan. Yeah. Tough love with soft eyes.
He's really thought about it, haven't you?
I have, yeah.
Let's go with that.
It's a thing.
It is a thing.
That's what happens in lockdown.
Yeah.
You think about these things a little too much.
A lot.
Some Twitter followers have suggested that McGowan has already got a new job. Take a look at this. Yep, the similarity is uncanny. At Burgermeister23 on Twitter revealing McGowan's new role with the US MASH 4077th Unit. I always thought McGowan reminded me of someone, Major Frank Burns. Too good. And what is comedian and songstress Chelsea Jones going to do now for her country songs and her obsession with McGowan? Like this gem from 2020.
'Cause all these city boys are so straight-laced and straight-faced. They came straight from UWA. So I'm gonna head to Rockingham, find myself a country man. And when I do, I'll say, do you wanna pick me up? Go to the pub and then grab a kebab with me. Mark McGowan, I'm in love. I'd do anything for you and your heart, heart, heart. Do you wanna pick me up? Go to the pub and then grab a kebab with me. Mark McGowan, I'm in love. I'd do anything for you and your heart, heart, hard border.
Yep. There's nothing quite like a hard border closure, Chelsea.
And down the track when we try for a baby, will you wear the uniform that you wore in the Navy? I'll say,
oh, thank you, Lieutenant, for your protection. But like the Easter Bunny, I'll give you an exemption.
Do you want to pick me up? Go to the pub and then grab a kebab with me. Mark McGowan, I'm in love. I'd do anything for you and your heart, heart, heart. Do you want to pick me up? Go to the pub and then grab a kebab with me. Mark McGowan.
Oh, she's fantastic. That's the Mark McGowan official music video by Chelsea Jones on YouTube. Make sure you check out the whole thing. You will not be disappointed. Well, it seems like the marketing and PR industries are taking a hit every week these days, with one stupid woke campaign after another completely missing the fact that people don't want identity politics shoved down their throats every 5 seconds. We've had Bud Light, Miller Lite, Gillette, now Target in America. I think we'll need to launch a tone-deaf marketing award of the week, I think. If we did have one, this week's award would go to Victoria Police for this tweet from the people who brought you firing on protesters because they dared to question Victoria's draconian lockdowns in 2020 and 21. The Public Order Response Team, or PORT. Their HR and PR people thought it'd be a really good recruitment publicity idea to tweet this image. A little spot the difference puzzle with the text, "Can you spot the difference? Put your answers below." That's asking for trouble. You've seen their cars rolling through the CBD and around town when attending events, but do you know what they do? Responsible for public order events and incidents, both planned and unplanned? There's no such thing as a boring day in the office for our public order response team. Well, somebody doesn't understand how Twitter works. That was like a red rag to a bull. And after 215,000 views, guess how many likes the tweet had? 37. Not 37,000 or 3,700, just 37. This must be the worst Twitter ratio in history, surely. Most replies sort of followed this theme. Let me guess, they're both pieces of who are willing to arrest pregnant women, strangle children who don't wear masks, and pepper spray elderly ladies? Hashtag Dan's brown shirts. Yes, I'm sorry guys, but when you commit unprecedented violent overreach and stomp on civil liberties to the extent that you did in 2021 under the orders of an authoritarian government, and you ignore the protests of those who've suffered and mock them and call them nut jobs and call them deplorables, and then you find out you were wrong, you don't undo all that damage to your image overnight. And you sure don't do it by treating people as fools with little spot the difference puzzles. Give us a break. You're watching or listening to episode 208 of The Other Side Australia, your weekly shortcut to the week's best news and commentary from Australia and around the world from a classical liberal perspective. Sticking up for the values and economic system that made Australia great amid the madness of a world drowning in left-wing woke nonsense. If you like what we're doing and you'd like to support us, please do reach out, or if you'd just like to give us some feedback, info@othersideoz.com is our email address, info@othersideoz.com. That's AUS, not OZ. Drop us a line. Well, this week I watched one of the best and one of the most disturbing interviews I've seen in a long time. ADH TV's Alexandra Marshall spoke to the founder and head of the UK's Free Speech Union, Toby Young, this week, about where we are at historically in the West, and particularly in the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries, in terms of censorship of free expression and ideas. And the picture Toby painted is not good, but it is accurate. When you're swimming in the ocean like a fish, it's sometimes hard to see the water until someone comes along and points it out to you. Toby Young makes the point that freedom of speech is the most important of all freedoms, because without it, you lose all the other freedoms because you can't speak out to defend them. And in my view, Australia is in far more trouble than most places when it comes to limitations on free speech and a lack of real diversity of opinion in our media, public institutions, governments and corporations. Toby Young told Alexandra that the insidious ways in which censorship is creeping into our culture are truly frightening. And the religion of woke, that is the neo-Marxist identity politics worldview in which everything becomes about oppression along the lines of race, gender and sexuality, it is scarily advanced, especially in our arts community.
Yes, I think it's a really sinister development. It isn't just free speech that's been under assault in the past 15 to 20 years, like never before. It's also freedom of expression. We see it certainly in the UK, the emergence of sensitivity readers in the publishing world, who are essentially paid censors who go through manuscripts and take out anything likely to trigger the readers or likely to result in a cancel mob forming up on Twitter to try and get an author cancelled. We see it in the theatre, we see it in dance. If you don't subscribe to this very narrow set of progressive orthodoxies, it's very difficult to get funding, it's very difficult to find a venue that will stage your particular performance.
Toby Young says there is an upside, however. This kind of overreach by the woke left, the attempt to control every aspect of the culture, could turn out to be quite helpful to the free speech cause.
One of the challenges I've had running the Free Speech Union has been persuading young, progressive students, recent graduates, persuading them to care about free speech. They think everything's going their way. all the powers that be are on their side. So why do they need to stand up for free speech? It'll only help, male, pale and stale conservatives like me. And they've had it their own way for too long. It's time to allow other voices to speak. Whatever. And I try and persuade them that, well, it may be that you're not being censored on social media because everything you say, the censors agree with. But in due course, the wind may change. Speech restrictions are like poison gas. This is a great metaphor that Ira Glasser, the head of the ACLU during its kind of most legendary phase before it became captured by the woke church back in the 60s and 70s, Ira Glasser said that speech restrictions are like poison gas. If you're on the battlefield, you have the enemy in your sights, it can sometimes seem like a good idea to release the poison gas, but the problem is the wind can change. And that's what I try and persuade these progressive students that why they should care about free speech. Sooner or later, fashions will change. You won't be in power anymore. Your church will begin to fade in its influence and reach. And you'll need free speech protections just as we need them now. So it's short-sighted to abandon free speech. It's something that everyone benefits from, not just conservatives.
The Free Speech Union mounts legal defences for people who've become victims of cancel culture mob attacks. That's the gang bullying tactics of the grossly intolerant far left that terrorise anyone who steps out of line from the woke church. Toby Young says almost a quarter of the cases that the UK's Free Speech Union takes on are related to academics or students being shut down for challenging the orthodoxy of modern left-wing ideology in the very place that it should be most open to debate, our universities.
I guess the really disturbing thing isn't so much the intolerance of students, the success of activists in getting people no platformed, ostracizing anyone who challenges their very narrow dogma. The more worrying thing is the absolute absence of backbone on the part of the university administrators. I mean, what I was talking about before about free speech not being a natural mode, tolerating critics, dissenters is not a natural human impulse. You have to work hard at it. We have these institutions that have grown up. We have the free press. We have great universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Princeton, the University of Sydney. They are the stewards. They've been entrusted with preserving this precious and fragile inheritance. And they're not doing a great job of doing that. For the most part, university administrators just buckle.
It might be time to tie the university administrators' salaries and universities' funding to their willingness to allow and protect diversity of opinion and debate on campus.
It's quite unusual these days to see university administrators, vice-chancellors stand up to these student mobs and say, no, free speech is the lifeblood of this institution and we need to defend it. You need to become better, more resilient at coping with intellectual challenge and understanding how to defend your values. You're not going to be able to defend them if you don't know what the criticisms are. As J.S. Mill said, someone who knows only his side of an argument knows little of that.
Now, the UK government has taken some action recently which should be immediately replicated here in Australia. The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act has just been passed by the British Parliament, which will create slightly more robust protections for free speech on campuses.
And it also creates a couple of enforcement mechanisms to hold administrators' feet to the fire if they don't discharge these new legal duties to protect freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus. So that was an important victory, which the Free Speech Union, we've been campaigning for that particular bill for more than 3 years. So that was a great moment seeing that pass. I think that will improve things a little bit. But it is a crisis. The free speech crisis in universities is unfolding across the English-speaking world and increasingly now in continental Europe. And it is a potential disaster for our civilization, not least because Western civilization, the success of liberal democracies, depends upon a thriving, vibrant higher education sector.
It's Toby Young speaking with Alexandra Marshall here on ADH TV this week. He says it'd be very foolish of us to take our place as world-leading nations in higher education for granted. It's not like there's no competition emerging that's less likely to put up with an ideology built on lies and a false sense of reality.
We're gradually seeing Chinese universities overtake, Western universities in the global league tables. And academics tell me that in certain fields, if they actually have less freedom of speech than their colleagues do in China. Not if you want to talk about politics, if you want to criticize the Chinese Communist Party, obviously, but if you're a biologist, for instance, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you can teach your subjects at the University of Beijing in a way you really struggle to do now at Ivy League universities or Russell Group universities in the UK, because people will freak out if you tell them that sex is binary, or that some of our personality traits are genetically influenced. These are heresies now. Whereas in China, you can freely discuss at least those things, and that's shocking, a shocking state of affairs.
It sure is. That's Toby Young from the Free Speech Union speaking to ADH TV's Alexandra Marshall live show this week. And of course, you can watch the full interview on demand right here on ADH TV. Toby says they're hoping to set up an Australian chapter of the Free Speech Union soon. Until then, if you'd like to support their work and get on their mailing list, it's the freespeechunion.org. freespeechunion.org. They also have a daily publication called The Daily Skeptic. That's at dailyskeptic.org. Skeptic spelt with a C, not a K. Aussie comedian Isaac Butterfield has drawn a line in the sand following an episode of the fine SBS show Insight, which discussed the topic of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is what feminists call masculinity. And Butterfield has had enough.
The concept of masculinity, something that we men are born into, 50% of the world's population, something that we feel, something that we live every single day, is somehow toxic. That is the message, and that is terrible. That is an awful message to send.
Butterfield says that if you defend masculinity, you'll be called a misogynist, and that's bad. But he really drew the line at the SBS Insight show, likening him to actual men who have no respect for women, like online sensation Andrew Tate.
No, you stay in the house.
Great, wonderful. I'm glad I'm lumped in with him. Let's check out the show in question.
What is masculinity to you?
Everyone looks at masculinity as toxic masculinity. There's no positive masculinity.
The idea of this show is actually quite good. I mean, they have debates, and I think debating each other and having, respectful conversation is really, really important. Unfortunately, the man who they first start the show off with on the side of being masculine and someone who talks about how great it is to be masculine and how they want to be more masculine is this dude who LARPs, live action roleplay, and hits his mates with a foam sword. Not to mention he drives a Suzuki Swift. Perhaps not quite the definition of the masculine man we all aspire to be. There are plenty of guests on the show, and there are some good ones, but this dude had the worst introduction of all time.
Josh, you were raised by a strong feminist mother.
He's a funny man, is Isaac Butterfield. He then goes on to lament that normal men's rights activists get lumped in with crazy radicals all too often.
Isn't it funny how men's rights activists gets lumped in with all of those things, like extremism and far-rightism and supremacism? That's bad, because some men just want, equal rights, like in the children's courts. They just think that, they should have, equal opportunity to hang out with their kids. And not every mother is a saint. Not every father is a sinner. But anyway, they're far right. Good on them.
Obviously, there's the manosphere as well.
The manosphere?
It's an online environment of misogynists that can be broadly categorised.
Well, I've never heard of the manosphere. I've never been invited. But the professor explains it. It's got 4 different themes, 4 different groups, I guess. Men's right activists who are anti-feminists and believe family courts are corrupt and skewed towards mothers, which they definitely are. Men who go their own way, which I think is MAGAO. That's like an acronym. I'm not really sure what that means, but they don't want anything to do with women, which is weird. Pickup artists, apparently they're bad too. And incels, who hate women and punish them by not having sex with them, because that's logical.
Josh, are males treated unfairly?
I mean, where do you start? What we're getting an insight into here is the victimisation complex that really pervades the manosphere. Let's talk about the consistent structural inequality that prevents women, educated as they are, from progressing in society into positions of power.
Hey, can we talk about the question you were just asked? Are males treated unfairly? The professor goes on to say that women are treated unfairly, and sure, they are in many occasions. I'd like to point out that yes, men are treated unfairly if you consider these following things unfair. Higher incarceration rates, suicide rates, homeless rates, poverty rates, more likely to be killed at work. All of these can be classified as men being treated unfairly.
Yep, the manosphere. I love the way the left invent words. You've got to watch these words. They frame all debates by inventing words and controlling language. It's something we have to be very, very careful of. Anyway, my favourite part of this whole video was when Butterfield put music behind his rant to dramatically underscore his important points.
Brandishing an entire gender as evil, it's lazy and it's incredibly weak. Not to mention, it's a feeble way to live your life. Always falling back on the idea that it's everybody else's fault, not yours, for the things that are going wrong in your life. You never have to develop any further thought about topics. You just get told what to think. It's lazy, it's dangerous, and it's incredibly common. The reality about masculinity is this. Yes, there are assholes who are men who seem to be masculine. That is obviously true. Some men do shit things. Some men get drunk and fight. Some men hit their wives or their partners, right? But they don't do that because they're men or because they're masculine men. They do that because they're shit humans.
That's right. So if you wouldn't mind, feminists, and I know it's just the radical ones, but we'd really appreciate if you'd stop demonising the very fabric of our being as men, because that could be causing a few social problems of its own, like, I don't know, ridiculously high rates of depression and suicide. So please take your sexist ideology and your misandry and leave the 99% of men who do not act violently towards other people for no good reason and who use our masculinity appropriately to, I don't know, build stuff and defend women and children from threats of attack. Just leave us alone. Thank you. There's a current popular theory doing the rounds in conservative circles that left-wing political forces, socialists, Marxists and the like, hate the traditional family unit. So I decided to do some digging this week on whether that's actually true. According to an article on the education website Simply Sociology by Dr. Saul McLeod, a PhD from the University of Manchester in the UK, it's true. Karl Marx's main collaborator, the German philosopher Friedrich Engels, believed that the nuclear family was designed to further male control of capital. I kid you not. To further the control of money by men. Here's his theory. Engels believed that the nuclear family means that men can confirm whether a child belongs to them and ensure that wealth remains in the family through private inheritance. This, he argued, helped preserve capitalism by depositing wealth in a private family instead of passing it on to the community through the government, Dr. McLeod explains. I like the way they use the word the community to make stealing money from people sound nice. But we're sharing it with the community. It's all good. No, you're not. You're stealing it from people and giving it to a tiny, tiny group of elites who control the government so that they can use it as they see fit instead of as the original owner sees fit. That is socialism, and it's morally wrong. It removes control of how you might decide to spend your money in the economy from you and hands it to a centralised group of elites, almost always unelected in socialist or communist countries, and it simply doesn't work, and it never helps the poor and the needy. Anyway, Dr. McLeod writes that in Engels' view, the monogamous nuclear family emerged with capitalism. Before capitalism, traditional and tribal societies were classless and did not have private property. Well, that's just not true. The nuclear family predates capitalism by a long way. Engels also believed that family tribes existed in groups where there were no restrictions on sexual relationships and that anyone could have sexual relations with anyone else in the tribal group and multiple partners. How convenient for Engels. Dr. McLeod also cites the work of a modern academic, Dr. Natasha Zaretsky from the distinguished Brown University in the US. Zaretsky says that the nuclear family allowed the breadwinner man to feel in control and strong. Another sweeping assumption about family power dynamics there from our academic friends, which men apparently do not feel at work due to the oppression of the bourgeoisie capitalist class. See how it all fits together? So the nuclear family unit maintains capitalism because it prevents the working class from acknowledging its oppression and starting a revolution. Honestly, a 4-year-old with half a brain could see through this childish, oversimplistic ideology. It's absolute garbage. And you wouldn't want to maintain capitalism, the system that's, brought more collective wealth and ended more suffering and poverty than any other system in the history of mankind. We are better off in almost every way imaginable thanks to capitalism. Let's take a look at how things have improved since 1970. We don't have Australian data this well presented, but the American data can be assumed to pretty much apply to the rest of the Western capitalist world too. So this is Professor of Economics Anthony Davies speaking at a Foundation for Economics Education event about something you never hear much about in the TV news: how the world is becoming a better place.
Americans believe that the middle class is disappearing. Oddly, 70% of those same Americans believe they're in the middle class. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of data. It comes from the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau divides households in the United States into groups. Think about the poor, the middle class, and the rich. And I'm going to show you a bunch of bars. The height of the bar indicates the fraction of American households in that income group. So, for example, here's 1970. And these are all adjusted for inflation. In 1970, 16% of U.S. households earned what today we would call $35,000 to $50,000. In that same year, 1970, 24% of households earned what we would call today between $50,000 and $75,000, and 14% earned what we would call $75,000 to $100,000. That's the United States in 1970. 54% of households in the U.S. were what we consider middle class. In that same year, 35% of households were in the poor classes, 12% of households were in the rich classes. 1970.
Professor Davies then moves time forward, showing in 5-year increments from 1970 to 2017 what happened to the distribution of income in the United States. And all of these figures are adjusted for inflation to what a dollar was worth in 2017. So you can easily compare the real rise in value.
I'm going to move time forward and watch what happens to these bars. As you move forward to 2017, the last year for which we have data, what do you find? You find that the number of households in the middle class has fallen from 54% to 41%. The media is right. The middle class is disappearing. This is the evidence. But the unstated implication when we hear the middle class is disappearing is that the middle class has somehow migrated into poverty. But the data indicate that's not the case. From 1970 to the present, the fraction of households in the poor classes have dropped also, from 35% to 30%. Where have all these American households gone? They've entered the rich classes. Over this period, the percentage of rich households in the United States has risen from 12% to almost 30%. Almost 1/3 of us are now considered rich.
Wow. You won't read that in the Sydney Morning Herald, and definitely not in The Guardian, or hear it on the ABC or at school or university. We are so brainwashed to believe that capitalism is bad, that the very system of economics which has made Australia what it is bad. Not just that it has some bad outcomes, but that it is rotten to its very core. And if that's what we teach our kids, it's no wonder our country is turning into a debt-ridden, government-dependent, socialist hellhole of endless victims and whinging. But aren't we always told how much worse off kids are today than their parents and grandparents?
Now, people will respond to this and say things like, yeah, but I'm worse off than my parents and grandparents. I get a lot of people who say this to me, and this is after I show them all this data, right? And I say, okay, well, tell me, how is it that you are worse off than your parents and grandparents? And many, many people will say things like, I have to pay for things today that my parents and grandparents didn't. And so I say, well, tell me what? And they say things like, well, I've got to pay for my streaming media and my internet and my cell phone, and pay more for electricity and gas than they did, and of course health insurance, all these things. And if you add it all up, that's like $9,000 a year the average American is paying that his parents or grandparents did not pay. Well, here's the thing. You can do away with all those costs immediately. Cancel your Netflix subscription, cancel your Amazon Prime, cancel your Comcast, cancel your cell phone. Don't use electricity. Everywhere you go, walk or take the bus. And refuse all medical treatment that didn't exist prior to 1970. If you do all of that, you will attain the same cost of living that your grandparents had. Now, of course, nobody wants to do that. And that's the point. If you're able to do that and you choose not to, it indicates that the value you are receiving from all of these things exceeds, in your mind, the $9,000 they cost. So at least with respect to these things, this is not evidence you're worse off, it's evidence that you're better off.
But you'll never find the left letting reality get in the way of a good old-fashioned whinge about how tough life is. Life is tough, but it's not tough because of capitalism or free market liberalism. It's better because of capitalism and free market liberalism, by every metric and standard. Reduction of poverty, improvements in healthcare, longevity, personal liberty, and freedom from tyranny. All of it is improved by the system that encourages people to be the best they can be so that we all benefit. Capitalism. But they've turned it into such a dirty word that even to say, you know, I think capitalism is good, sounds somehow fundamentally bad or wrong. Why is that exactly? It's almost as if some people don't want us to have freedom to make our own money and succeed on our own merit, because then they wouldn't be able to impose their will on how we all live. The control freaks would have to let go. We have about 2 seconds to turn around this idiot thinking we've fallen into as a society, that somehow socialism would be better for us than capitalism. It is time for a great reset, all right, but not the kind the WEF wants. Quite the opposite. It's time for a great reset on the toxic thinking that's infected Western liberal democratic capitalist societies. A great reset of the assumptions that we've been making about what is good and bad in our world for the past 50 years. We need to shut down the woke teachers and lecturers and journalists, and when I say shut down, I don't mean shut them up forcibly or anything like that, but we need to move away from that, and the HR departments and the marketers and the churches and everyone else who is pushing socialism and leftist ideas. And we need to give our poor, brainwashed, woke kids a great reset of their worldview, because this negativity is killing them, literally. We need to say enough, no more complaining, be grateful, stop sprouting opinions when you don't know what you're actually talking about, show some modesty, study hard, don't believe everything you're told, and think for yourselves. But I know I'm sounding like a scolding father. Probably another reason why the Marxists hate the nuclear family. Just look at what they've done to the status of the father figure in our society over the past 50 years. There's a reason why every dad in an ad on TV is portrayed as dumber than their kids, and usually much dumber than mum. Which brings us back to Marxism and its attack on the family. Another Marxist named Althusser, who was active in the 60s and 70s, argues that the family is a part of the superstructure of capitalist society. Althusser says it socialises children into norms and values that are useful to the capitalist ruling class. The family is an ideological agent, a puppet of the ruling class. These people were bonkers. They thought that these little theories that they made up were a good explanation of reality for no other reason than that they fit their narrative of how the world worked, which was a really sick, negative view of humankind. And heaven forbid that the family should socialise and normalise kids. Oh dear, it's much better that the state and the government does that, right? Coming back to Dr. Saul McLeod from the University of Manchester in his article, he explains that Marxists have done little research to investigate whether their assumptions are true, and that the Marxist view of the family has been criticised for its over-focus on the negative aspects of the family while ignoring the satisfaction it gives people. In any case, we can say that yes, the political left wing, the Labor and Greens people do really believe that the community, not the nuclear family, is the main and best social unit for raising kids. So no, the Conservatives in America and here in Australia are not jumping at shadows. The state really does want to control your kids and be their main socialising force. And as a result, we need to be aware of this and push back on it every single time we recognise it happening. Which brings me to this. US President Joe Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, lamenting the fact that states are starting to legislate against gender-affirming care, in quotation marks, one of those phrases that the left make up, and gender transition treatments for minors. That's because the science isn't settled, Karine, and no, it's not good to dive into radical surgery and hormone treatment when we don't know the long-term implications. But for Karine, such laws are anti-LGBTQI+. Not really. They're definitely not anti-LGB and Q. And as for the Ts, well, maybe they're right, what's right for the Ts too.
There are more than 600 pieces of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation out there. A few hundred of them are anti-trans community. And that matters because we have to call that out. And we've never seen this level. It's historic in the number of pieces of legislation. And I've met a lot of parents of trans kids in the past couple of months who have told me these devastating stories, whether they're in Texas or Oklahoma or wherever they are, saying how they now have to seriously consider leaving their state to protect their child. And that's something that we have to call out and continue to be very clear about, that these are kids. These are our kids. They belong to all of us.
These are kids. These are our kids. They belong to all of us. No, they don't. My kids are not your kids, Karine. Sorry, they're my kids, not the government's. Where have we heard that before?
But I mean, truly, when when you see our kids, and I truly believe that they are our children, they are the children of our country, of our communities. I mean, our future is really bright if we prioritize them, and therefore prioritize the climate crisis.
Okay, climate change, of course. But are governments in the Western world really teaching kids about gender and sexuality choices in primary school? I mean, surely, that's got to be just some right-wing nutjob conspiracy theory, right?
A family can be made up in many different ways.
It's called SOGI, for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identification, a curriculum that teaches public school students across Canada and that gender is fluid. In other words, your gender is not dependent on what parts you were born with, but rather what you feel like in the moment.
There's people that are boys, there's people that are girls, there are people whose gender might be a little bit of both or might even be neither.
Lessons include books about transgender children, such as 10,000 Dresses, and songs like The Rainbow Song.
Gender won't decide the choices we make. Some boys like dressing up, some girls like catching snakes.
The SOGI curriculum started in British Columbia in 2016 and is quickly spreading throughout Canada.
I just thought, who decided that this was okay to teach our children?
Author and inspirational speaker Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson is a leading voice against the SOGI curriculum.
And we are seeing the results of that now, because some kids are reacting very emotionally and saying, and they're in fear. Will I suddenly struggle with feeling like a different gender inside of my body? No.
Carrie Simpson of Culture Guard, another leading opponent, calls the curriculum nothing short of child abuse.
All those beautiful qualities that make young girls, beautiful girls and women, are being basically vilified. The things that make our boys boys are being, taken from them. So things of equating young men to being strong protectors is something that's now evil.
That's part of a 2018 report from Christian news channel CBN. The science is simply not settled on modern gender ideology, and imposing this stuff on our kids is a problem. At a legislative hearing in the US state of Montana earlier this year, a researcher on gender ideology and its impact on culture, Dr. Jay Richards from the Heritage Foundation, gave this expert testimony.
In recent years, the U.S. has seen a huge spike in the number of minors diagnosed with distress over their sex bodies, now called gender dysphoria. Such diagnoses for those between the ages of 6 and 17 rose by at least 20% per year between 2017 and 2020, and by at least 80% simply between 2020 and 2021. Behind these alarming statistics is a dangerous ideology derived from gender theory. This gender ideology displaces the sexual binary of male and female, which describes all mammals, including humans, with a subjective notion of gender identity that is independent of the body. Hence, champions of this ideology avoid references to sex. They typically define gender identity as something like one's internal sense of gender. Note that this is both circular and unfalsifiable. The most toxic fruit of this ideology is in medicine. Hence the faddish response to gender discordance called gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming is, in fact, sex-denying. For minors, it involves refashioning the body to fit a distorted idea in the mind, rather than helping minors adjust their distorted self-perception to their bodies. In the U.S., gender transition surgeries for adolescents increased nearly fivefold from 2016 to 2019. Despite a slowdown during the COVID lockdowns, this upward trend continues. Until recently, childhood gender discordance was extremely rare and mostly restricted to pre-pubertal boys. Most cases actually resolve themselves after the child passed through puberty. In contrast, starting a child down the gender affirmation pathway makes it far more likely that he or she will go all the way, even if he or she later comes to regret it. Here's the dirty little secret. There is no reliable scientific evidence that these treatments improve the long-term mental health of these minors, let alone that the benefits outweigh the many risks.
That's Dr. Jay Richards from the Heritage Foundation. Now, let's be clear. On this show, we're not saying that we shouldn't accept that a very small percentage of people do have genuine gender dysphoria. And that should be understood and respected, and these people should be treated with kindness and compassion. But it is a huge leap to then say that we need to be teaching kids that gender is something that we all choose. That ideology is not grounded in science. And that's where it crosses over from teaching acceptance to a kind of implanting of ideas and confusion on the kids we have a responsibility as parents to protect. I think the LGBTQI+ community, which is of course itself a left-wing myth. There are plenty of LGBs who don't agree with the left-wing gender ideology and many who outwardly oppose it. But I think the T's need to be careful. You can push your agenda, but leave the kids alone. You cross that line and you're going to get one hell of a backlash. And that is really good for nobody. The nuclear family is the best unit of society, and it has nothing to do with the suppression of the working class. That is just Marxist rubbish and belongs in a big garbage bin with all the other Marxist nonsense. Seriously, when are we going to stop teaching Marx as if he was some great thinker? He was a buffoon who couldn't even look after his own income and even bathe himself properly, by all accounts. It's time to let Marxism go, people. I look forward to the day when the only mention of Marx at our universities is an embarrassing and fleeting historical one. That's all for this week. A long but important show, I think. We'll catch you next Friday for The Other Side Australia. And on Tuesday night, remember The Other Side interviews, streaming at 6 p.m. and available on demand at any time thereafter, as always. And this show, The Other Side Australia, your weekly shortcut summary of the news and commentary of the week. We're streaming every Friday night at 8 p.m. and we're available on demand afterwards, so you are fully clued up for the weekend on the news of the week and can sound really smart at all the social events. If you like the show, remember our saying, don't just like it, share it. The independent media needs your active support to keep on doing what we're doing. So have a great week and we'll catch you soon.